Okay, hi everyone. I'm Samuel Poirier-Poulin. I'm a PhD candidate at the Université de Montréal in Canada, and today I'll be talking about trust, confidence, and hope in the video game A Summer Zen, Hong Kong, 1986. This presentation is based on an article that has been accepted for publication in Game, the Italian Journal of Game Studies. So that's always, super exciting. It should be out in early 2023. I also wanted to mention that, the topic this year were freedom and oppression. My presentation will be mostly about trust, but I'll be talking also about freedom and oppression. I feel that freedom is often around when we talk about trust, but it's a bit more implicit in my presentation, but I'll try to make these connections explicit whenever possible. So A Summer Zen is a visual novel developed by Chari Sasso and Tida Kietsungden, two Vancouver-based game designers, better known under the name Oracle and Bone. The game was published in 2020 and tells the unlikely love story between Michelle, a disciplined office worker who lives with her mother, and Sam, an independent and free-spirited woman who owns a video store. The story is set in Hong Kong in the summer of 1986, in the vibrant district of Mong Kok. The game explores the themes of desires, freedom, and hope in a time and space, quote, where Asian traditional values and Western idealism clash and converge, end quote. So this is how the game designers describe the game. The game's aesthetic is inspired by media from the 1980s, and more specifically, anime, Hong Kongese cinema, music videos, fashion magazines, and manhwa. So manhwa are comics in the Chinese-speaking world. These influences are noticeable in the character design, color palette, and visual references to city pop, but also in the soundtrack, which incorporates elements of funk, Italo disco, synthwave, chillwave, and vaporwave. So what I wanted to do today is to offer an analysis of the theme of trust and its variation in A Summer Zen, with a specific focus on three elements. So how trust takes place between the game characters, between the player and the characters, and between the core player and the video game medium. As you'll see, I'm drawing a lot on the work of Michele Marzano, who's an Italian philosopher, and she wrote a paper about trust from a humanities perspective, and she actually wrote it in French. Um, yeah, so I think it's a nice paper, so I'll be talking about it a couple of times. So as she writes, quote, strictly speaking, trust refers to the idea that one can rely on someone or on something. The verb confi, to entrust, from the Latin confidere, whom, with, and fidere, to rely, means indeed that one gives something precious to someone by trusting him and thus abandoning oneself to his benevolence and good faith. The etymology of the word also shows the close links that exist between trust, faith, loyalty, confidence, credit, and belief, end quote. So for Marzano, trust is closely tied to human existence. It creates strong relationship where dependence and vulnerability meets. It changes our relationship to the world and to ourselves and makes us realize that we're never completely independent. Trust is in opposition with fear, and more precisely with the fear of the future. It reintroduces into the world the possibility of hope and changes our relationship to time. And as we'll see, trust also leads to a certain freedom. My analysis draws inspiration from works that have proposed a reparative reading of certain video games. Reparative reading was originally theorized by Eve Sedgwick in 1997 and was later theorized again by Heather Love in 2010. And so, when Sedgwick theorized reparative reading, it was really in opposition to what she called paranoid reading. And paranoid reading is the type of critique we often see in academia, in cultural studies, critical theory, media studies as well. And in this kind of critique, the author will usually highlight all the problematic elements of a text. So reparative reading is a reaction to that, and it has been used in game studies by Kara Stone. So I'm just going to quote her because I think she summarized this quite well. So she writes, quote, reparative reading is a form of academic creation where the emphasis is on finding forms of healing and reparation rather than the seemingly endless approach of finding more things to be depressed about. I remember being an undergraduate student and being put off by queer theory's constant pointing out of homophobia and opening up of queer wounds. When I came across Sedgwick's reparative reading as a grad student, I felt suddenly engaged with queer theory again. What can academia do to heal, to comfort, and to reform dominant understandings of the world into something that enables queer people to keep living? End quote. And this is a feeling I have as well. And this is not to say that paranoid reading is never necessary, but like Sedgwick, like Cara Stone, I believe that reparative reading is just as valid. Reparative reading does us good, makes our reader feel good, and allows us to take care of each other. It is a compelling style of critique to analyze games that we find uplifting and that we believe might benefit other players, and this is how I see a Summer's End. So the first thing I wanted to do in my presentation is to talk about trust and actually it's trust and reluctance and how it takes place in the game and how it affects the relationship between the game characters. So trust and reluctance are really at the center of Michelle and Sam's relationship. Michelle's life is the opposite of Sam's and comes down to work and sleep. Michelle is relatively satisfied with her life and plans to marry a suitable man and start a family. This will allow her to satisfy her conservative mother, who made several sacrifices so that she could go to university and live a rather peaceful life. Meeting Sam upset Michelle's plan, and little by little, Michelle begins to lean on Sam, who is much more comfortable with her sexuality than she is, and her desires as well. Michelle accepts her invitation to the restaurant, goes to the Ruby Bar with her, and eventually accompanies her to Saikung by scooter. Michelle is initially reluctant to accept each of these invitations. Trust must be constantly renegotiated and shared. But her fascination for Sam pushes her to keep seeing her. So we can see Michelle on the right and Sam is on the left, and she's the one driving the scooter. So that's also interesting as well. Sarah Ahmed nicely describes this feeling. Quote, queer feelings may embrace a sense of discomfort, a lack of ease with the available scripts for living and loving, along with an excitement in the face of the uncertainty of where the discomfort may take us. End of the quote. In addition, despite the presence of dialogue trees throughout the game is very linear and the player has little control over the course of the story. The player themselves must accept to be brought along by Sam and by the game narrative. This feeling of trust in Sam, both on Michelle and on the player's part, is related to what she inspired, but also to the game's affective environment, which favors intimacy and bonding. Michelle and Sam repeatedly wander in the busy street of Mongkok. However, only them appear on screen, as if their meeting placed them in a different time and space, making these moments more intimate and giving more importance to their love story. The universe seems to have been created to make their meeting possible. These intimate moments usually take place in the evening, and it's interesting here to think about that in relation to the work of Will Straw. So Will Straw highlights that the night is a force capable of defining a space. It has a sensibility of its own. The urban night, more precisely, evokes a space-time of, quote, reinvention, transgression, and aesthetic fluidity, end quote, and is a source of hedonistic and morally suspect pleasures. In The Summer's End, the urban night is a refuge from heteronormative society. The night becomes a space-time of possibilities. Time seems to stretch, queer desires become more and more palpable, and Michelle becomes aware of her attraction to Sam, the player who accepts to be affected by the atmosphere of the game, by the neon color of Mongkok, and by the bewitching and at times sensual music, can feel the connection between the two young women and be moved. And I would say here that A Summer's End shows us that effects can be transmitted to the player through ambience, and more precisely through the vibration that colors and music generate in the player's body. At the same time, as Bruce Begu points out, a pleasant ambience is always surrounded by a halo of worry. For Michelle, the urban night represents both a vibrant space-time filled with opportunities and a frightening one because it is associated with queer desires. Michelle feels that what she's doing is wrong, and she's scared to lose face. This leads her to reject her queer identity and to mistrust Sam, and eventually pushes her to stop seeing Sam for several weeks. Later in the game, while Michelle is at the restaurant with Joey, she sees Sam leaving the premises. Time stops, and the player is entrusted with the most important decision of the game, staying with Joey or following Sam. If the player chooses to follow Sam, Michelle confesses her feeling for her and kisses her in a torrential rain. Michelle's trust in Sam now takes on a whole new dimension. It takes the form of a jump into the void, to retake the expression of Marzano. And for the first time in the game, intimacy is possible in the public space. Michelle even says, quote, "And in the torrential rain we kissed. It didn't matter to me at all if anyone else saw this. It didn't matter who saw us or heard us. We had nothing to fear." So trust here is so strong, thanks to love, that it becomes, quote, "a protective envelope that makes action in the world possible," end quote. It allows one to blossom and it makes existence possible. And we can think about that again in relation to freedom, right? Michelle feels more free now than before, thanks to love, but also thanks to trust. Um, Lastly, this reflection on trust and uncertainty is related to the context of the time and to the future handover of Hong Kong to China. As I said, the story takes place in the summer of 1986, roughly 2 years after the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed. So according to this declaration, the United Kingdom would cede Hong Kong to China on July 1st, 1997, and Hong Kong would become would be considered as a special administrative region for 50 years under the one country, two systems principle. So there is all this uncertainty going on in the game. And so Michelle mistrusts the future and considers immigrating to the United States, while Sam wants to stay in Hong Kong and see what the future holds. Marzano, again, interestingly writes, quote, trust between human beings arises from the moment one endeavors to live and sojourn in a place of transit, in the space of the back and forth of the encounter, end quote. So Hong Kong appears here as a space of transit, closely linked to trust. In a certain way, Hong Kong can also be associated with queerness. Helen Lung and Lucetta Kam compare Hong Kong's political uncertainty to following the post-colonial transition to the unpredictability and fear of queer desires. Like Hong Kong, queer lives are unstable and do not have a promised future. So now I wanted to talk a bit more about the relationship between the player and the game character. But before doing that, I wanted to introduce this concept of intimacy simulator, which is a concept that was proposed by Fabienne Sassi to describe visual novels, and it's a concept that I find super interesting. And so she used this term um, to talk about visual novels, but because for her it emphasizes the proximity and the intimate relationship the player develops with the game characters. So when you play visual novels, the game characters progressively reveal more and more information about themselves, and are also physically close to the player. Um, like many visual novels, The Summer's End is also written in the first person, and you control Michelle. But I would say that despite all that, Michelle appears as a character separated from the player. She's much more a character narrator than a traditional player character or an avatar. The game contains several introspective sequences in which Michelle talks about her past, her family, her personality, and her impressions of Sam. And I would argue that this kind of segment in The Summer's End can be seen as a form of confidence. The relationship the player develops with Michelle over the course of the game takes the form of a double unlocking, which is a term that was theorized by Catherine Kerbrad-Torreccioni and Véronique Traverso, and they talk about double unlocking in relation to the confidence. And so they say, that the confidence implies a mutual relationship between the confident, so the person receiving the secret, and the confieur, the person telling the secret. And they say that the confident must be available and show interest in the confieur, who must be willing to open up to others. And I think that the visual novel is a privileged space to reflect on this relationship because, when you play a visual novel, the text appears on screen little by little, one or two sentences at a time. And you have to press on a button, you press on the mouse, for example, in order to display the following sentence. And so each time you are pressing a button, I would argue that you are showing the character that you are there, that you are interested in their story and that you are listening to them. And this in turn pushes the character to continue their confidence. So this double unlocking here is possible thanks to the interreactive nature of video games, thanks to the back and forth between the game and the player. Once the player has completed the two-thirds of A Summer's End, the story changes perspective and the player controls Sam's during an interlude of roughly 1 hour. So this is when Sam saw Michelle for the first time. The theme of confidence is particularly noticeable in this segment, where Sam openly talks to the player about her feeling for Michelle. And to a certain extent, this confidence is also a way to touch the player, to show them that Sam's feelings are genuine, and to push them to do everything they can to reunite the two young women. Now, to go back to Torricelli and Traverso, when they talk about the confidence, they say that the reader, or we could say, the player here by extension, they say that the reader is an intruder, and they talk about the voyeuristic nature of confidence, and I think this is a bit over the top. And I would argue here instead that the player in a summer zen is an accompagnateur. So the player accompanies the characters. They are in a supportive position and act as an intermediary who seeks to make the relationship between Michelle and Sam possible. They develop with them a relationship of care, and they want really, they want the best for them. They want to see a love story that ends positively. Okay, so now I'll try very quickly to talk about the relationship between the queer player and the video game medium. So I'll just start by saying, that for some queer players, myself included, it can be difficult to trust video games and to see them as a medium capable of telling queer stories. There is always a possibility that these stories will feature stereotypical queer characters, and tragically, we have seen that many times before. Things are changing slowly, fortunately, but it's still a bit risky, I would say. And so here again, to quote Marzano says that trust can be dangerous. And she says, quote, it always comes with the risk that the custodian of our trust does not live up to our expectations. End of the quote. We're not all equal when it comes to the question of trust, and it's more difficult for groups who have been historically erased or misrepresented in video games and in other media to trust this medium. A Summer Zen is interesting because it's a bit the opposite, right? It tells a beautiful love story between two women, and it gives queer player confidence in the capacity of video games to tell such stories. Through Michelle and Sam, queer players can see themselves as being capable of action. Existing in the mediatic space gives them the strength, the desire, and the courage to exist in the public space. At the end of the game, Michelle finds the strength to exist in the public space as a queer woman. The queer player who made this possible finds the strength to exist symbolically in the public space alongside Michelle and Sam, and hopefully will find the strength to exist in the real world as well. Silvestra Mariniello was originally here talking about the power of cinema, but I think that we could talk here about the power of the visual novel. Which in recent years has offered several touching queer stories and has truly become a privileged space for certain queer gaming communities, notably in North America. And it's quite interesting. So I did these stats myself, and when I was looking at that, I went on itch.io, and then when you put the tag LGBT plus content, and then you add the tag visual novel, you realize that 49% of all the games with LGBT plus content are visual novels. And on Steam, it's 56.5% of all these games. So there is something very special about visual novels. You can also find lists on the internet of must-play LGBT plus visual novels, notably to celebrate Pride, and there are also Reddit pages discussing visual novels with queer content. And I would say it's much harder to find these kind of lists and forums for other game genres. I also wanted to very briefly mention that this relationship between the audience and the medium is also explored in A Summer's End, but not in relation to video games, but in relation to cinema. And for Michelle and Sam, cinema is a trustworthy medium that allows the spectator to spend time with the past and reflect on social changes. So the game draws interesting parallel between the lives of Michelle and Sam and the film New Women, which is a Chinese film that was released in 1935. There are also references to other important women who have important for the cultural history of Hong Kong. So Yam Kim Fai, for example, Bridget Lin as well, and they can all be seen as queer icon in a certain way. And more importantly, there are also references to Anita Mui, who's this very famous Hong Kongese Kento pop singer, actress. She's often described as a diva, but diva in a very positive way. And she was performing in the 1980s, 1990s. And she's also known for her performances that challenge traditional gender representation. So very, famous queer icon. And what is interesting is that she inspired the character of Cecilia. So we can see Cecilia on the right, and in the game she owns a bar popular among girls in the know. So for both the player and the game characters, the past generates an empowering form of queer nostalgia. As Nishan Shahani points out, nostalgia is filled with political possibilities. It helps to forge a collective memory, to create a space of belonging in the present, and to imagine a different future using the affective force of the past. And Gilad Palva, along the same line, reminds us that retelling the past has played a major role in shaping an LGBT plus legacy with its own icon and symbol. So in a summer Zen, revisiting the past becomes a way to disrupt reality, to make history less limited, to stay hopeful, and to trust the future. So now I'm just going to conclude very quickly. A game like A Summer Zen is reparative and allows for a form of healing. It is soothing to be told that everything will be all right. The game ends with a warm and comforting image. Michelle and Sam are sitting next to each other, hand in hand, in the restaurant where they ate together when they first met. Michelle's eyes are closed and her head is resting against Sam's shoulder. She is at peace with herself. The game leaves the player with the words of Michelle full of hope. So here you can read the quote. While the player has accompanied Michelle throughout the game, it is a summer zen that accompanies the player once the game is over, that resonates with them and leaves them with a feeling of well-being, that has the potential to change their daily lives and their ways of being in the world. So that's it for my presentation. Here you have the bibliography. And yeah, so thank you for listening, and you have my email here if you want to, write to me for some reason. Okay, so thanks for watching.